Ministries is one of those things where IT security is often overlooked or not considered until after the fact. Look, you're not a corporation, I understand, but cybersecurity is still very important because of that data that you have on your members or employees.
Hello, and welcome back to the Lightwell Podcast. In our most recent episode, we spoke with Kevin Norton about cybersecurity risks for ministries. One of his biggest recommendations was to consult with an IT professional. So we're taking him up on it. And in this episode of the podcast, we're going to speak with Matt Cohee. He is the Senior Manager of Network Infrastructure for Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. And he's going to help us understand even more about the risks that ministries face in this area. Let's get right into our conversation with Matt. Well, as promised, we are joined today by Matt Cohee, the Senior Manager of Network Infrastructure for Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. Matt, we are so thankful for your time today. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So because of your specialty area, I think our topic for today is kind of obvious, but if you could kind of set the table for us, what exactly would you define as cybersecurity as it relates to ministries?
Cybersecurity to ministry is really how do you protect the data and how do you protect the systems that run your church? Data is a kind of a broad term, so I would say anything from donor data to volunteer data to even children's data specifically. All of that is what's considered personally identifiable information or PII, and so we have a responsibility to protect that PII as best we can.
Oh, that's very good. And so, to jump right into the practical part of our conversation, what are some initial steps that ministries can take that you've seen to protect PII?
First and foremost, know where the PII resides. Some churches have PII on paper, donor details, donor checks on paper. Where are those stored? Can those easily get up and walk away? Or is it behind a locked door and a locked cabinet? That's kind of one side. The other side is also digital. If we use an application like Planning Center or Church Center or PushPay, what donor information or member information do you have in there? And also, who has access to that data? Those are all really key, important things that need to be discussed and decided upon just to protect that PII.
Well, and one of the things we actually talked about with Kevin Norton when he was kind of giving us his field intelligence about this, and so I'd love your kind of IT professional intelligence on it, is when a ministry has more than just their staff involved in these systems, they also have volunteers. How do you educate and train a broad group of people like that, some that aren't employees, on how to protect PII?
You absolutely nailed the biggest challenge that cybersecurity professionals have is how do we educate the public? If you work at a company, the company usually does a pretty good job of educating their staff to protect their systems and their data. But if you work in a nonprofit or a church, how do you do that? That is the biggest problem that we have is education. To do that, I would say to tap any one of your church members. Is there anyone in IT that goes to church there? Or do you have an IT security champion that kind of is your IT person there at the church, or a volunteer? If there are local colleges around, that's another place to go check to see if they have an outreach program. Oftentimes they do. So here locally, we have several colleges that have outreach programs. Another place that's not often considered is actually the local library. We have a wonderful library system here locally that they have free educational classes on cybersecurity at a very basic level. But those are ways just to get this cybersecurity information in front of the general public. That may be something that's not just go out and hire a company to do that.
That's really good. So you would say maybe the best step that a ministry can do to bring consistency to that training between staff and then volunteer personnel is to have someone who's the resident expert who brings commonality to the language and to the training and all of that. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would even call that person the IT security champion.
That's good. That's really good. Okay, so let's talk about what happens in the event of a suspected attack. So it's like weather in some ways where you can't always know how to prevent something from happening, but your best move is what happens next. So if a cybersecurity breach is suspected or if it happens, what are the next steps you recommend for ministries?
Yeah, the answer to this one's probably a little counterintuitive. When you have a cybersecurity event, the very first thing you want to do is shut your systems down. That oftentimes is not the best first step. I'm not saying in all cases that's not true, but generally speaking, if a church or any ministry is going to have a cybersecurity event, it's going to be one of two things. One is what's called malware, where you download something or click on a link. And then the second one is what's called data exfiltration. That's a fancy word for an attacker tries to get onto your system to take data that you have on your PC or servers and try to exfiltrate or exfil that data to something that they own, and then they can hold that ransom over that individual ministry or church. I've seen that happen before. So the response is largely the same. If you suspect that there's a cybersecurity incident occurring, what I would say is shut off the internet, because that will prevent a lot of that data from being exfilled outside of your network. Like I said, there are corner cases where it does make sense to shut down a system, but once you do that, you lose forensics that either local law enforcement or potentially the FBI, if they need to get involved, or even a cybersecurity recovery company is going to need those forensics to be able to start a recovery, really kind of create that timeline. This happened, then this happened, then that happened, and this is what they're facing to be able to recover. So I would often advise not to just shut all the systems down the very first step.
That's really good. I mean, that's pretty basic, but also really helpful. Just set the level, shut down the internet. Now, let's talk about communications then
Yep.
in that same period of time. So you take that initial step, you shut down the internet. Let's think about it in internal and external terms. What kind of communication steps are most helpful in recovering from an incident like that?
What I would recommend is have what's called an incident response playbook pre-built, and have those communications plans pre-built. During a cybersecurity event is not the time to figure out roles or responsibilities, because it's going to be really hectic. And there's
Right.
going to be high emotions. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on that really needs to be figured out well in advance of an actual cybersecurity event. So I would say create your incident response playbook that does list out those roles and responsibilities so that you can manage both internal and external communications. And most importantly, have a dedicated person that's responsible for that. Now, the incident response playbook rather doesn't have to be elaborate. I would say it needs to cover a couple different things. Roles and responsibilities for individuals who manages communication internally and externally. What systems are prioritized within your environment? And I'll give you a great example. Let's say this is a large church that has a large online viewership, and the internet and their AV systems is absolutely critical to that church's success. They're going to probably prioritize something different than a smaller, more rural church that most of their people are going to be sitting in the pews. They might be concerned about something completely different. So if you have that listed out in your incident response playbook well in advance, your team's going to march in the same direction and start recovering the applications and the systems in order instead of people just kind of fighting it out day of.
Oh, that's so good. All right. So, with that in mind, what are some of the common missteps or pitfalls that can happen in this initial response, the recovery stage after a breach?
I would say panic. I mean, it's gonna be chaos, it's gonna be high stress. People will panic, it's human nature, there's not much you can do about it. But going back to what I was saying is, if you have that detailed out in your incident response playbook, your response and your recovery is gonna be so much quicker. One of the things I see often when there's a cybersecurity event is, tensions flare because maybe the children's ministry thinks that their system's most important versus the AV team, but that's really dependent upon what your church does and how does that church do it. That's where your priorities. So a lot of misaligned priorities and not understanding what's important to the church's success from an IT perspective is what I see a lot.
Hmm. That's really insightful. Now, on the topic of prioritization, when a cyber attack happens, how do you advise a ministry to sort of assess the damage? How bad was this? And then what steps do we take first to kind of prioritize those efforts based on the nature of the breach?
That's a really good question. I would say it's also a very technically challenging question. It becomes a lot easier if you have a dedicated IT staff, or even maybe you've outsourced the IT staff to a local company to handle your IT equipment. If you're kind of running on volunteers and something like that, it becomes significantly more difficult because you may not have the expertise, or your staff may not have the expertise to begin that recovery. that's when it becomes challenging. If you're a larger church or have outsourced IT, one of the first things you need to do is engage with that IT team to be able to start the recovery process. But it's really challenging in terms of if you have mostly volunteers, what comes first? Prioritize what? It really just depends on how your church does business. But to begin the recovery, I would actually say, and I highly recommend that churches have local and remote backups of their systems done at least weekly. What you want to do is if you have a cybersecurity event that takes your systems offline, it's going to be much faster and much easier to recover from a backup that you have. So I would recommend either an online backup. There's several companies that do that. Or if you do what's called a local backup with an external hard drive, you would have two, one that stays there at church and one that doesn't. The reason why you want to have an offsite backup is because let's say, God forbid, you have a cybersecurity incident and then your church burns down or it floods or something bad happens, someone breaks in. You want that backup to be able to restore services as quickly as possible external. And if there's a fire or flood or stolen, that external backup at someone's house will be the starting point for your business.
So it's interesting the way you started that. It really does point back to what you said initially around preparation. Having someone or
Absolutely.
a team in place is the biggest thing to being able to assess how bad was this and how do we recover from it. If you don't have someone who owns the IT security plan, then it's going to be much harder to do the technical work involved of assessing what happened, how bad is it, and what do we do next. Did I hear you right on that?
Absolutely. I think it
Okay.
ends and starts with having a detailed incident response plan. To fill in that a little bit more, I would say if you want to be specific on it, that'd be one thing. For example, let's say you have an incident response plan for a power outage. You don't think oftentimes that's a cybersecurity event, but it certainly could be, right? Or, ransomware or malware, because your response is going to be different based upon the type of attack that it is, and your recovery might be different based upon the type of attack that it is.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk then, and this may really have some commonality with shutting down the internet, but how do you protect evidence and prioritize, the investigative efforts that come after this? What steps would you give for recovery on the protection of evidence front for a church?
Yeah, that's actually one reason why very rarely does it make sense to shut down your systems. Uh, when your system is running, you have certain evidence that remain on your PC, but as soon as you shut that down, that evidence is lost forever. Once it loses power, it's lost forever. Um, and again, the recovery is kind of challenging based upon the type of incident that it is, but if you have that backup storage somewhere, and you've severed the internet connection, really the next step is engage some sort of incident response team or a person that can help you recover. Again, whether that's a local company or whether that's someone that you've designated at your church to be your IT person, it's really going to be on that person to begin the process.
So many ministries out there may not be big enough in size to have that pool of talent that includes an IT professional in their congregation or the finances to hire an IT professional. So, for the common ministry out there, are there tools and technologies that might help them be prepared without having, the ability to hire a person in place?
Absolutely. I think the first and foremost is keeping your systems up to date and patched. That's both your systems and your applications. If a ministry can manage to do that, they will eliminate a ton of issues. Secondarily, have antivirus installed. That's kind of the basic thing is have some sort of protection. Now, this is basic protection, doesn't need to be anything elaborate. Uh, Third, I would say be really careful and cautious about the websites you visit and the links in email that you click on. Attackers are becoming very, very good at making very convincing emails that get you to try to do something you wouldn't normally do. Click on this link to pay a bill, click on this link to view a Facebook post, stuff like that. Be really cautious. We can have all the technologies and processes, but it really comes down to the individual human being that manages those or looks at the email that could really bypass every single security tool that we implement. So it really comes down to education and really just follow your gut instinct. If you get an email that says click on this link to visit a Facebook post or pay this invoice, ask yourself this question. Do I know this person? Does this make sense that this person is sending me this email? Usually if you trust your gut, you're usually right.
Hmm. That's very good. Now, I know how hilariously out of date a question like this can become because of the rapid rate of innovation in this space of cybersecurity and technology in general, but are there any emerging trends or things that you're seeing with more frequency that maybe weren't happening 5 years ago in this area of cybersecurity?
Absolutely. This is a clear and easy answer. With the advent of AI, artificial intelligence, chat GPT, they're all the same. The days of being able to spot an easily misspelled email as phishing, those days are gone. They've been gone for a bit, but they are 100% gone. The advent of ChatGPT and AI has really taken things to the next level. It's really easy also to fake someone's voice as well. So, for example, let's say your church and ministry uploads videos to YouTube. It takes about 10 seconds to train an AI model on your voice and to create a very convincing voice that sounds just like you, Adam. And what is being done, this is more on the corporate side, not necessarily for nonprofits and churches, but they're seeing these types of attacks where a CEO gives a presentation and an attacker will grab about 10 seconds of that video, match up his voice and his way of talking, and then create a voice model and then calling people that work for that organization, let's say someone in finance saying, "Hey, person in finance, I need for you to wire me $20,000 to this bank account." Now, to the person receiving the call, it's going to sound probably not exactly like the CEO, but it's very, very close. And the issue here is, as technology gets better, it's going to get to a point to where it's going to be imperceptible that it's not really the CEO. And that is
Well,
terrifying. But it all comes back to this. Does this seem right? Does it make sense that the CEO or whomever is calling me to do this thing that I usually wouldn't do? It comes back to trust but verify. Maybe you do hang up the phone and call his cell phone or her cell phone. Maybe you contact them directly outside of phone. Walk by their office, walk by their desk. Trust but verify.
that's so interesting that maybe our greatest tool in this space where technology is evolving so fast. That's what you scared me to death, actually, in your explanation of that. And rightly so. I need to be sobered up in this area. But our greatest tool, maybe in this environment, is intuition and curiosity about what exactly am I receiving? And is it something that seems congruent with what's normal? Would I normally get this
Absolutely.
request from my pastor or my CEO or the finance person? I mean, it feels like that would be a hard skill to train if someone doesn't already have it, but it's an empowering skill to train if someone's listening to something and needs just that first check, that first question to ask. They should feel empowered to ask it. That's a really good
Absolutely.
step here. So,
Absolutely.
okay, what would you say, because you pay attention to these spaces, where can they pay attention on the internet or elsewhere to what's latest in this conversation around cybersecurity?
Absolutely. There are several reputable websites that I use. Most of them are pretty highly technical, but some like thehackernews.com, that's a really good resource. The local and federal government actually have really good programs as well. One of them is CISA, CISA.gov. That's a really good one to learn about, recent trends. Also, another area is, again, go back to your local colleges and your local libraries. Do they have recommendations? Some of these things might even be regional as well. The attacks and types of attacks faced in the Midwest, which is where I'm at, might be different than on the coasts or elsewhere. So understand what's local and really reach out to those local colleges, local libraries, local government, and they should be able to direct you in the right direction.
Okay, Matt, let me just kind of take a little bit of a diversion from our conversation and ask you a little bit more of a personal question. You are a highly designated IT professional. Why have you chosen to put your superpower to use in service of ministries when you could work anywhere in IT?
Yeah, good question. I would say ministries is one of those things where IT security is often overlooked or not considered until after the fact. What I would like to do, and what I'm currently trying to do, even with this podcast, is really bring cybersecurity to the forefront to say, look, you're not a corporation, I understand, but cybersecurity is still very important because of that data that you have on your members or employees. So that's something that I'm really passionate about is educating the public and really bringing that community of cybersecurity to the general public.
Well, that's outstanding. It makes me think of like stewardship. If your definition of stewardship is just caring well for the things that are in your world, in your care, then this is just another issue of a ministry stewarding their people's personal information well, just like they would want to do that with their money or their kids or anything like that. It's a very important thing. I really appreciate you devoting your expertise to serving ministries in this way. So, Matt Cohee, I really appreciate your time. Before I wrap up, is there anything that I missed? Anything that you were thinking we should talk about this? This is an important topic that I didn't get to today.
Not really. The only thing I would like to reinforce, and I've said it multiple times, is really think about your incident response playbook. Be prepared, not scared. If you list those things out in your incident response playbook, and really just be prepared for kind of every scenario. If that scenario happens, you are prepared and you can take action instead of just kind of panicking.
Outstanding. Matt Cohee, Senior Manager of Network Infrastructure for Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. It has been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for what you do for Brotherhood and for the church.
Likewise. Thank you.
My thanks once again to Matt Cohee. What a great conversation. I have really enjoyed these last two, focused on cybersecurity, and I hope you are getting something out of this that's helpful to your ministry. Thank you for making this a part of your day, for joining us. And until the next episode of the podcast, if you want any other resources related to this conversation or other things that Lightwell does for ministries, go to lightwell.com. We'll see you next time. Until then, go and let it shine.